Okay. Took me a minute to make it happen, but I'm here. Let's see who I have. I have Ralph.
Hey, Paul.
Hi, Ralph. How are you?
Good.
Jerry.
Good evening.
How are you, Jerry? Is Carol coming in? So. Let's see if we have a quorum. We do. Bear with us, everyone. We're just getting council members on board here, and then we'll kick it off. Oh, Jerry, Ralph, Carol. So Chris and Bob, we'll give them another minute and then we'll get started. Here's Chris coming in.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I'm gonna kick this off and get it started. So, Alicia, are we broadcasting on YouTube as well?
Yeah, everything's ready to go.
Okay, good, thank you. All right, good evening, everyone. This is a special presentation of the Hideout from Hideout Utah Town on the Silver Meadows annexation technical studies that we discussed at the meeting I did earlier in May on this, the final reports from the study consultants. This meeting is being broadcast on YouTube live channel, limited Zoom participation. If questions come up during the presentations that you want us to look at, please email them to hideoututah@hideoututah.gov. Alicia will be watching for those mails to come in and will get us the questions. There is a limited amount of time for each of the 3 studies that we're going to do, so we'll get through as many as we can of the questions that come in. But I'll have to cut them off so that we don't hold up the next presenter. It is June 8th, 2021. I'm calling this session to order, and I'll be taking attendance of council members just for the record. Chris Beyer.
Here.
Thank you. Carol Hazelton.
Here.
Thank you. Jerry Dwinell.
Here.
Thank you. Ralph Severini.
Here.
Thank you. And to my knowledge, we don't have Bob. Nadelberg, but that's okay. Hopefully he'll join a bit later. They're going to have three presenters tonight. The first will be Chris Bender from Fair and Piers, who's done the traffic study for us. The second will be Laura Lewis and Kate Werrick from Lewis and Young, who did the finance study. And finally, Brian Smith, Brent Robinson, and Martin Banks, who did the environmental study. And then we also have tonight, we'll have a couple of special guests from the EPA talking a little bit about the OU1 site that's nearby, just so people can get some more information on that as well. Chris Bender, you are a co-host, so in theory, you have the power to share your screen.
Yep.
So I'll introduce Chris, again from Fair and Piers, and he's going to share some slides with us and take us through the outcome of the traffic study. Thanks, Chris.
Yes, can you see my screen?
Yeah, we're about to. It says you started, so
Oh, okay. Oh,
it hasn't quite. There it goes.
is it going? Can you see the memo on one side and Google Earth on
I
the
can
other side?
see. I can. Everything except there's a small box at the bottom of the screen that is not being shared. That may be your. It's fine. It's not creating a significant issue.
Okay.
So there you go.
All right, just to step through this. So the Google Earth side over here shows three study intersections that we looked at for the study. So the first, oh, hold on. Sorry. Looks like I'm running into some technical issues. Sorry about that.
Not yet.
Okay.
Still not showing sharing.
All right. This should work now.
Now you're sharing.
Okay.
And for the record, sorry, it looks like Bob Nadelberg just joined. Bob, can you confirm? Bob Nadelberg. Hello?
I was just getting him admitted. It took just a second, so.
Bob Nadelberg, can you confirm your presence?
I am here.
Thank you. Sorry to get you out of bed.
Now my back is killing me, so I had to lay down. But yeah,
I understand. All right, Chris, go ahead.
All right. Now that we're past all the technical difficulties, just had to have those at the beginning of the meeting. Now they're out of the way. So we have looked at the traffic study. There are three study intersections that are already existing that we looked at. The first one is at SR 248 and Richardson Flat Road. The other one, the next one is at Richardson Flat Road and Jordan L. Parkway. And the third one is at SR 248 and Browns Canyon Road. All three of these two out of three of these, both intersections on SR 248 are currently operating at unacceptable levels of service in existing conditions, present tense. I'm sure many people who have driven through these two intersections already understands and experiences that on a regular basis, that if you drive through here, you're likely to encounter significant amounts of delay, especially if you're on the side street. These two intersections are both scheduled to be signalized in the not too distant future, coordinated efforts between Park City and UDOT are working along SR 248 to get signals at both of these locations. And so when we looked at these, the existing conditions show that they're both failing once they're signalized, understanding that traffic in the background is going to likely continue to grow over the next 5 years. Even with that background growth, that's this column right here, we're showing operations in acceptable ranges. Just for context, this table shows a letter grade associated with how traffic is performing. UDOT considers level of service D or better to be acceptable on UDOT routes, and then E and F to be unacceptable. So here it's showing that the side streets on intersections 1 and 3 are both failing. In the future, once it's signalized, it's likely to improve to be acceptable conditions, which anyone driving through there from the side street having to wait at a minute on average these days, they would see a significant improvement with the signal breaking up the flow of traffic. Once the project is added to the mix and trips are generated from the project development, we're likely to see some small increases to those areas, but the overall trips planned to be generated by the development are low enough to the point where the intersections continue to operate at acceptable levels throughout 2026 with the project. We also looked at a 20-year horizon in 2041, both with and without the project. And in both cases, the 3 study intersections continue to operate acceptably. That's assuming that the development is built, right around here, and all traffic loads onto Richardson Flat Road and then has to exit out through SR 248, may head down Jordanelle Parkway or come out at the SR 248 Browns Canyon Road intersection. We did a follow-up study that looked at incorporating a north access to here. Due to spacing requirements, the north access would have to be about a half mile away from this intersection right here to start. And looking at the opening year, 2026, about that intersection is looking okay. Level of service C means when you show up, when you drive up to the stop sign, you might have to wait a little bit, but it's within the realm of reasonability. You're not going to feel like that stop sign is holding you up forever. By the time we get to 2041, however, 20 years out, that stop sign is going to start to feel really sluggish in the PM. When we analyzed that intersection with a signal, and it is looking like a signal would be appropriate in such a far future horizon year, what with the east and west traffic growing at the rate that it is, a signal would help to break up the traffic so that the Richardson Flat access, the hideout development, the Silver Meadows development with the north access would operate acceptably. I'm to understand that north access is currently in the works with UDOT. The developer is working with them to get that approved. And so our analysis shows that immediately when it opens with, even if it opens up with a stop sign, it'll still operate acceptably for quite some time until a signal is able to be put into place. I'm going to stop there for a little bit and let any questions come in
So, council, you have the ability to jump in with questions if you have any.
Yeah, so this is Jerry Dwinell. Thanks, Chris, for the presentation. Question, I assume that with Skyridge development booming over there now, they're going to be using that Jordanelle Parkway, and that's factored into this as well?
Some background growth was assumed through there, yes. On this intersection right here?
Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
And of course, the only way out is one of the other 2 intersections that you have highlighted. Right.
Yes. So when we talk about the 2026 background and the 2041 background, those volumes here I can show. So here are volumes as they presently stand as we can see, intersections 1 and 3 are having a rough go of it. And when we project out to the future, the volumes are considerably higher from existing, but with the signals here and here, they're still operating acceptably.
So for the benefit of those who don't know how to read this, this 4-part
Yes.
chart, can you take us just quickly through that?
Yes. So thank you. So this diagram right here shows the traffic volumes as they approach from the south to the north through this direction right here. So each set of numbers reads left turns, through movements, and right turns. And the numbers in parentheses are for the PM peak hour. So for example, over here, there isn't a leg. And so that's why these say 0, because there's no traffic moving through there. But there is traffic moving north along this way. And so in the AM peak hour, we observed 465, or sorry, rather, since this is a 2026, we project 465 trips heading along this direction in the AM peak hour, and 1,443 trips moving along this direction in the PM peak hour, just northbound through, right here. And each of these is, so this corresponds to intersection 1, this corresponds to intersection 2 right here at Jordan Parkway, and this one corresponds to intersection 3.
And what percentage add are we looking at the development itself to generate? Because those are huge numbers, and I'm curious to know what the development itself is generating from those assumptions.
Yes, that's a good question. We don't have it broken down by percentage. That is certainly something that I could look at afterwards. But here's the total trip generation that we calculated to be generated by the development. A total number of trips to be generated by the development. So you might look at this and say, wow, 10,000 trips, that is a lot for a 24-hour period. But that is both in and out directions, and it's also, you know, the whole day worth of trips. When we go over here and look at the total number of trips that's being spread out, we're looking at, 400 and something trips going in and out in the PM peak hour, close to 900 trips in the PM total, back and forth. And that is spread out between those 3 intersections, and also that north access once it gets put in. And it's worth understanding that 100 trips, for example, in a single movement is enough to impact how the experience is felt there. It's equivalent to, more than 1 car extra per minute, right? That's to kind of give some context there. But when it's spread out over, 3 intersections to get out of there, right? If we're talking at the Richardson Flat, and then also the north axis, and then also Browns Canyon, it does disperse that demand quite a bit. And looking at the overall impacts of the development, it does not appear that the intersections will operate any more poorly than they currently do. In fact, once the 2 intersections that are planned to be signalized are signalized, they're looking to operate significantly better than they currently do.
So we have 10,000 trips being generated by Silver Meadows development. How many trips are happening regardless of Silver Meadows?
Depends on the horizon you were looking at.
The same horizon, the same as the 10K.
So opening year, this is peak hour trips. So kind of a rough planning number. I don't believe we have the annual daily counts. But comparing the PM peak hour, right? That one's around 900. That's an easy number to compare. We're looking at, 600 southbound this direction in the PM, or sorry, almost 700 southbound and 1,400 in the northbound direction. And then over here, we're looking at, you know, what is this, about 8,500-ish total between, you know, left throughs and rights this way, and about, you know, just short of 400 coming north this way. For comparison, you can scroll down to the version with the development. Oh, sorry, this is just the trips generated. This is combined. The majority of trips going through this intersection right here are going to be, turning in through this way. It's going to be turning in. It's not going to be adding to the through traffic here, nor to the south through traffic here, and the left movement right here, which is fairly empty right now, would require, you know, some storage lane that's already there, and which allows people to make this left turn in through this direction. And then through here, we're also not seeing huge percentages northbound or southbound. It's a lot of turning movements in here that are currently infrequently utilized movements. And so we're kind of filling in the gaps that the signals will have once they're implemented, if that makes sense. So signals implemented, there's no one making that right turn already. Once we have the development come in, there's already green time. You know, the signal's already green, so people are traveling through. Now we're also just turning right along with them, if that makes sense.
Hey, Chris, could you do me a favor? This is Ralph speaking.
Okay.
Could you go back to the table?
Mm-hmm.
With the numbers, yeah, thank you.
Yes.
So I may have missed something here, but the 6 columns to the right of the 10,429, they don't add up to they don't add up to 10,429. So I'm
That's
assuming that those numbers at the bottom totals are just snapshots at certain point in time, so to speak. Is that correct?
Those are peak hour, Ralph.
Yes.
Just
Thank you,
peak
Phil.
hour, okay. And thanks. And then I'm just going to look at the big numbers here, the 5806 that adds into that 10,429. That's being generated from the shopping center. Is that correct?
Yes. And so these land uses over here, these are based on ITE trip generation rates. So ITE stands for the Institute of Transportation Engineers. And that organization, you know, performs, you know, hundreds, thousands of traffic studies, looking at individual development and seeing how many trips that development has, and then compares that to the size of the development, whether that's, you know, based on number of dwelling units for a residential, based on number of square footage for something retail, number of students for a school, things like that. And so they come up with trip generation rates that we can apply to our proposed land uses. Like, for example, the shopping center, or, you know, we use that for general retail. When, you know, if we know for a fact that it's going to be a bookstore, we can use the bookstore rate. But if it's kind of up in the air, shopping center is a nice general one to use. So we'll use that. And then from that, we know, okay, so here's the shopping center land use. Here's the ITE code. Here's how many thousand square feet. That's our unit. And then we know, based on the ITE trip generation rate, we can expect 5,806 total trips throughout the entire day.
So that would be people coming into the shopping center and coming out, which could be local to the development, obviously, and local to the area. So I don't know if they'd be able to take any of the local roads, but I'm assuming that's factored in. And then the other big number here is 2266. So I mean, that's close to 80% of the load being generated from those two figures. So that's all internal, I'm assuming, to the single family areas. Am I reading that correct, Chris?
That is a good point. So This number down here, internal capture, this number approximates, sorry, using another document published by Institute of Transportation Engineers, they've come up with rates where we can understand how different land uses will interact with each other. So a residential land use will attract X percent of trips from a residential one, the retail residential, or office mixed with entertainment or what have you. They break it down into a few different combinations. And so this number right here, all of these italic numbers or italicized numbers are negative trips. We're taking these trips off of this initial subtotal because these are trips that are not impacting Ridges and Flat Road. They're not going to 248. They're staying internal to the development.
Okay, that's a great number. And
yes,
does that relieve? I mean, some of the reason for having the commercial site is certainly to relieve traffic on Kearns as you go into Park City. Is there any analysis done on any relief for the Kearns Boulevard part?
Yes, so we did do a separate select link analysis using the travel demand model in the area to see how much traffic we would pull away or pull off of Kearns Boulevard toward the development that would normally be going to Park City, for example, like from Hideout to Park City or from Park City to Hideout. That number was small enough to the point where we felt like we wanted to leave that out in order to be conservative with our analysis results. We're looking at just a couple percentage points to the point where the amount of diverted traffic wouldn't necessarily impact the results either direction. Just to play it safe, we just assumed that all of those trips would continue to be going where they were. That being
Chris, why do you
said,
think that is? I mean, why do you think that is? Because I mean, the whole thought here is that the people in Hideout will not have to go down Kearns to do a number of the things that they do with frequency.
And to follow up on that, if that shopping center is generating, 5,800 daily trips, they're not going somewhere else.
Mhm. Yeah, that is a good point. As far as where they would be going otherwise, I would need to talk with our planner who helped out with that analysis. I do not know that off the top of my head.
I mean, there's only one other option, and that's heading east towards Camas. And I know experientially very few trips run that direction. They all run towards the west.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's such a big number, Chris. It's like 58%, close to 60% of the number just being generated by the commercials. So if we're really dumping that much traffic into the commercial area from not only Hideout, but obviously Park's Edge and Black Rock and the other areas, and that's a positive, I would think.
Yes.
In general, even though it sounds like you're trying to remain very conservative in your approach to where that number is being generated and the effect and impact on the area. But okay, that's a big number. So
Yes.
it would have been almost worthy if we could have broken it down a little bit more.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I got my earlier question answered really either. So if we're generating 10,000 new daily trips,
Mhm.
how does that impact the existing traffic? I mean, if we're doubling the traffic, that's something we ought to know about. If we're only 10%, if we're only adding 10%, that we ought to know about as well. So we need to understand, proportionally how we're affecting the traffic in the area.
Okay.
Well, they've got the baseline numbers, Jerry. We could just do them. I mean, Chris, if you roll up to the starting point where the intersections are failing, we've got those numbers.
Yeah. So the and those graphics that Phil's referring to are specifically referring to the AM peak hour and the PM peak hour. So as far as the daily percentage, just a second.
Well, and I also want to make sure whatever that time frame that 10,000 is geared to, that's what we want to see the baseline and the projected baseline numbers. Because if that 10,000 is projected to be 5 years from now, I don't want to look at today's numbers. I want to look at 5 years from now numbers, the projections of the baseline.
The trips generated are fairly static based on the ITE methodology. It doesn't necessarily change from year to year. You know, as they continue to release more data, you know, we could redo the analysis and say, oh, here's, you know, if today were the existing year, here's how much would be, you know, going in. But just using the data that we have, you know, over the past few decades, the numbers are going to be pretty much the same between today and 5 years from now, at least as far as our development is concerned. The background will continue to grow. And so we use 2026 as our opening year, if you will. It's our five-year horizon analysis.
I want to make sure I understand. You're saying that the baseline is not going to change from today to 5 years from now?
As far as, so if we were to wave a magic wand and the development were to sprout out of the ground today, or if we were to do that 5 years from now, the development itself would generate a very similar number of trips between now and then, if that makes sense.
So I think what Jerry's trying to, he's trying to understand the background. He's trying to figure out how much more we're adding to what happens if we don't build it. Right?
Okay. Yes.
It doesn't, right? So
Yeah.
the background's going to grow because there's other growth around us. So that's going to continue to grow, and those numbers are going to go up whether we build this subdivision or not.
Yeah, and we all know experientially traffic doesn't remain the same. So I'm trying to understand what how the baseline remains the same, because we all know it gets worse.
Right. There are a couple of different factors in play here. So the background traffic, you know, the traffic from all around, that will continue to expand and grow because there's more than just our development being built out here. You know, there's stuff to the north, there's stuff down to the south. You know, this whole area is experiencing tremendous growth in all directions, really. So the background growth, so when we have, you know, 2021 background, that's looking at existing conditions that we went out to the field and counted ourselves. 2026 background, that's accounting for planned developments, that's looking at the travel demand model of the area and understanding, you know, the area around us is going to continue to grow. And so that's what's increasing in the background. Our development right here, you know, if we build a school for 100 students, there's going to be the same number of trips going to and from that school now and 20 years in the future. Does that make sense?
Assuming the enrollment doesn't change, yes.
Correct. Right.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
so
that's why he's saying those numbers don't change, Jerry, is that basically there's a capacity for, you know, a lot of the facilities, at which point they become overused and people stop using them because they can't have to stand in line, you know, too long. And they look for other solutions. So they say that whether it sprouts up today or sprouts up 5 years to now, the traffic through a given square footage is X.
correct.
That's all it can practically accommodate. So that's why Chris is saying the development numbers probably don't shift tremendously on the time frame as far as what comes from the development. It's all the background noise. So our impact, you know, as the background gets bigger, our percentage impact gets small.
Yeah, so if I can make sure I understand this and restate it another way. So the existing development, what's already built, is generating X traffic. 5 years from now, assuming nothing new gets built, that traffic remains relatively the same.
That's correct.
Okay, and it's the new developments that are happening in and around us that are the projected numbers of increase.
Yes.
Okay.
So guys, we selected a limited number of minutes for these guys. So let's finish up if there's anything else for Chris. Otherwise, I'd like to move on to the next presentation.
As far as getting a percentage of traffic demand, rather than, you know, try to whip something together, you know, right now on the phone call, I can sit down and actually crunch those numbers and get you a quick memo summarizing that information after this call.
And
That'd
if
be
we
great,
can
Chris.
post that to the website then, so, folks can
Yeah.
follow up there.
Yep, sure, we can do
Yeah.
that.
Okay, great.
I'll post everything, Jerry, that comes in.
Thank you.
All right, Chris, thank you very much for your time. If you would stop sharing, thank you. Next on the agenda is.
Mayor, sorry, excuse me, it's Chris Meyer. Just a point of order. Are we going to be entertaining questions that have come in to hideoututah.gov mailbox about the traffic study?
Yes, I was assuming that Alicia would inform me if we'd seen something. So, Alicia, do we have anything new that's come in?
Yeah, I sent you a couple of emails that have come in.
Oh. All right, I didn't know because I didn't have you. If you would text or something me next time. So one of the questions is why can't other people vote? It's the state law. You can't vote if you don't. It's a hideout application, and that's the way it works. I'm sorry for that, but that's how it works. There was a note on cycling. And there was a question around shoulders and bike lanes. Definitely shoulders. I think that's a really good question, and we will certainly build into our planning if it's successful to accommodate the biking activities because we're hoping people will bike. That's one of the goals of this annexation. And then,
Mayor, can I comment on that one?
Sure.
Yeah, so there is already a bike, like an old rail bed bike trail that goes between Park's Edge and the Retreat and goes through Richardson Flat. And as I recall from our AMDA agreement that that would become a paved bike trail, transportation trail for people to get around, which would parallel the road. I don't know if that question that was presented was asking about biking on the actual roadway itself. And was there anything studied in that regard?
There's nothing studied about people riding bikes on the roads themselves, like on 248, and which happens a fair bit, as we well know. So that's another piece of the puzzle we can look at, Chris. The third question is that there was a question around the development agreement stating that there had to be a northerly exit as part of the development to proceed. That's still an assumption. The development agreement requires that to be done with UDOT approval, and it doesn't. It means that what it means is that until that is secured, we would not authorize any development in that area per the current MDA. Okay, so those seem to be the questions. Thanks, Chris, for calling that out. I missed Alicia's note, so it was my deficiency, not hers. Excuse me. All right, let's move on to Lewis and Young. Kate and Laura, one of you wants to share your screens. You are set up to be able to do that. Thanks, Kate. We see you.
Hey, just so you know, you're on mute.
Yeah, just
There we go.
it's
better if I'm not muted. Thank you very much for letting us come present to you today. We're looking forward to this and sharing the information that we learned about the annexation. You have an important decision in front of you, and it's always helpful to look at the numbers. But numbers.
Sorry,
interrupt
Kate.
you. On my
message on-
screen, it's got give subtitles a try blasted right in the middle of the slide.
Let's see.
There you go. That'll work.
Perfect. Good. Thank you.
Go into presentation mode. Are you just seeing the one screen?
No, we see both.
Okay.
What you had done a minute ago, we could only see the one.
Okay.
Or 30 seconds ago.
I'm gonna stop share, and then I'm going to reshare.
Yeah, we were seeing the presenter screen, not the presentation screen.
Yep. Okay, let's try this again.
Just do it that way, Kate. It's okay.
I think
Don't put it in presentation mode. We can do it that way.
Okay. I think I just figured it out though. Are we good?
Yes.
Good job.
Perfect. Okay, so there are several items that are going to impact the study, and it's not just the numbers. You have the traffic, like we've looked at with Chris, and then there's also other items. But I'm going to be taking you through some of the numbers. So this is just a brief overview of the different items that we'll be discussing, and I want to bring your attention to the last bullet point. There were a few items that we did exclude. Those revenues and expenses that could be tied together and to development building permits, we pulled out because building permits usually are offset by the fees that are charged. So the work that goes into it offsets itself. So those self-funded categories have been omitted. And then others elements that couldn't be reasonably tied to population or other growth markers, like any debt expense or items like that. So let's go ahead and look at the annexation summary. So the area is about 348 acres. You can see this is the developer's site plan. It includes residential, commercial, and then civic facilities. They are proposing about 200 acres of open space, a place for a city hall, a place they'll be constructing a fire and police department building, and then with the different residential units, they are proposing, well, we are estimating that the population will increase by about 1,440 residents. That's a pretty big increase in your numbers. But along with that is that commercial element, which you do not currently have. You can see in that table that we've estimated the assessed value of different elements in the project. There are some affordable housing components in each of the different housing areas, except for the single family lots and the twin home lots. The developer did not include any affordable units in those categories. Go ahead and go on. So I'm going to go through our revenue assumptions and also our expense assumptions so that you can see where why the numbers that we have were derived. And then I'll show you a table that shows, we call them the costs and the benefits and the comparison of those revenues and expenses. So with the property tax, we used your current year tax levy. I understand that may fluctuate in the future, but for a good baseline, we use that your current tax year levy as our starting point. With the sales tax, there were two different elements that were included in that. Because you don't have a historic brick and mortar component within your town, we took some comparable cities and communities within the area and use them to develop a commercial squares, or sorry, excuse me, commercial cells per square foot amount that we have increasing over time. So when the commercial finally is constructed, we're estimating that beginning to be done in 2023, it'll have about a $222 a square foot price tag on it in commercial cells. So that's good for you. This is a very conservative number. Depending on what is constructed, you will likely see more. There's just not detail on what exactly will be going in. So that's a fairly good starting point to begin with. And then the other component of the sales tax is that per capita spending. This we also have built into the model with an inflator on it based on your historic increases and that increase is 1.3% per year. So every resident in your city currently is spending about, it's around $99 a year. Generating new sales tax at about that amount. So each new resident in the annexation area will be generating about that in the initial year, and then it'll increase over time. Then based on for our franchise taxes, your franchise taxes, we base those on estimated usage per square foot. That includes gas, telecommunications, electric, those services, you get some tax off of those. Then with the Class C road revenues, that's another revenue source that the city and the town is benefiting from. We use the developers' estimated road miles and road length and lane miles to predict this, along with the potential build out population in the annexation area. It's anticipated that the annexation area will have about 4.3 miles of roadway, and that'll be about 22 lane miles. So going both ways, you won't have any one-way roads. So that's where those assumptions are derived from. So with our expenses, we have an inflator built in of 2% per year. So you're not staying constant with your expenses. They're always increasing. In your general government, like I mentioned earlier, those that could be tied to building permits, we have excluded. And the other costs that are included were calculated on a per capita basis, assuming a minor economy of scale, meaning you won't have to hire a new person for every single position. There's going to be some built-in wiggle way. You also won't have to purchase a new computer for every single person. There's already computers and equipment that you have in place. For public safety, I had a conversation with the fire chief, and he recommended that for this, that we continue with the current methodology that they have, which is using your historic cost based on assessed value to predict the public safety costs that will be occurred in this area. Public Works is also based on the assessed value with some of the economies of scale. They won't have to buy new truck necessarily or the exact number of new trucks for the area because you already own some. And then that Class C road expenditures, we looked at your historic costs and used that as the basis for those future costs as well. And Parks and Recreation is based on a per capita, though we significantly decreased this amount because a good portion of the parks that are proposed will be maintained by an HOA. So with all the assumptions covered, this is the table showing you the numbers. I'm showing just 4 years, so you don't get your mind boggled by 20 years, and then the totals, and then a net present value of those amounts discounted back at 4%. So over a 20-year period, we're estimating that your total revenue brought in will be about 15.15 million, and that your overall expenses over that same period will be about $12.34 million. So your net benefit will be about $2.8 million. You'll notice on that property tax line, because we held your property tax constant, that in 2027, as they aren't all the way built out, it's significantly lower, but then in 2032, they will be built out. And so we hit that constant number that follows through time. A major item on this that you don't currently have, because you don't currently have the brick and mortar of, is that sales and use component. That, like I've said, that's a fairly conservative number, and it could be quite a bit higher. So we are anticipating for you in this annexation to have quite a significant benefit over a 20-year period. And you can see annually that we're projecting it to be positive. Some other items, briefly look at this. I know I mentioned it. The developer will be financing and constructing some amenities. You'll have that town hall, the police and fire station, the mountain lift that goes from town center up to Richardson Flat, several trails, open space, and then they'll be turning over some land for a future city, or not a future city, a future school.
Sorry, Kate, this is the mayor. Sorry, I was going to interrupt for a second. That lift study is underway. There is no decision at this point on whether that lift will ever be built.
Okay.
Just want to clarify that.
Yeah. Sorry. All items are proposed, and they were included on the site plan, so I included them for you. I apologize for that. But this gives you a quick look at the property tax benefits that will be provided by the proposed annexation to other taxing entities in your area. We included Wasatch County, Wasatch School District, you're listed here again, the Fire Protection District, and Special Services. These are the taxing entities for the area. So you'll notice that they also will be getting some property tax out of this. And over the 20-year period, with you included, it'll generate about $107 million in property tax revenue for all the taxing entities.
So I'm going to jump in again and just remind you that the projection for Hideout is a straight line on our current tax rate. So if we're forced to raise taxes for other reasons, then that number would change, obviously.
Yeah, and the tax rates for the other taxing entities were held constant as well. So that is a good point to make. Thank you.
I can interject with a little bit of sidebar information. I did a very quick analysis relative to another project about what the property tax rates have done in Wasatch County over the last 10 years. I can pull it up. It's not right in front of me. But the trend line is positive. Tax rates, as hopefully you as city council people know, your constituents may or may not be aware, but due to truth in taxation under Utah law, those tax rates naturally decline as property values increase, excluding growth. So again, if there's you get the benefit of the full benefit of any new structures or buildings that are built. But if a building just stays the same and the value increases because of inflation, like we're all seeing now, like on steroids, if that value increases, if the taxable value increases, the property tax rate naturally declines, so that conceptually the same dollar amount is being delivered to the local government from that same piece of property. Local governments have to act to capture the inflationary, that's kind of a deflationary aspect, right? So they have to act through a truth in taxation hearing to capture to maintain that tax levy. And I looked at all the taxing entities, and they what seems to happen is they go down for a few years and then oh gosh, we need to catch up. They bounce around by entity, but the trend line overall is positive in terms of that rate. Now, obviously, we can't, the town can only control its own tax rate. You can't force others to raise their taxes, but it is, we can certainly provide evidence that over the past 10 years, there's been a positive trend line in that regard.
Great. Thank you, Laura. So in conclusion, these are a couple items. As Laura mentioned, property tax revenue is neutral unless there's a truth in taxation review done. The addition of a commercial center does provide a new revenue source for the town, which is something to consider. And there are non-financial considerations for why or why not to annex infrastructure and civic requirements or improvements that may be brought online, the ability to have local control of that area if it were to develop even without annexing in. Would you want to control it, and would you lose that control by not annexing? Then the community cohesion, having boundary irregularities can be challenging for some civic groups. And then the question of whether or not you would be required to provide services even if you didn't annex them in, that is a question that may be considered if it were to develop even if not annexed. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Phil and any questions that the council may have.
Thanks, ladies. Very, very nice. So I have a couple email questions. We'll get to those at the end, but let's throw it open to the council. Again,
I have a question.
Go ahead, Jerry.
So the Silver Meadows is in Summit County, but it looks like we did Wasatch County in the analysis. So can you talk to why we're not showing a benefit to Summit County and related?
Yeah, I opted to do Summit, Wasatch, after some conversations with city staff. Just as that's what you have as your current taxing entities, that seemed like the direction to go with that. I could easily find out what it would be if it were Summit County instead of Wasatch County. That wouldn't be hard at all. I'd be happy to follow up with that information.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that Summit County does stand to benefit financially from the annexation as well.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, I can follow up with an email with that information.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks. Good question, Jerry.
Mayor, this is probably a question for you. It doesn't appear that the calculations included the lift, but if I remember correctly, the developer said that they would kick in if we didn't have the lift. There would be a corresponding. Yeah, what was the number on that, Mayor? And when would that kick in? And that would go to our bottom line, I think.
That's correct, Ralph. I don't recall the timestamp for that, and I don't want to. I think it was somewhere around. It was either, I can't remember if it was 250 or 400,000. I think it was 400,000. 250.
I thought it was higher than that.
I thought it was 600,000.
Yeah, I thought it was 600.
600. All right. So I don't know. We can get that number, Ralph. I think that's a good point. So if we don't build the lift, there will be a cash contribution.
Yeah, and it goes into that
50K.
What was that?
650K was what Nate said at the meeting a few months ago.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Brian.
So this is Chris. Can we go back, Kate, to where you show the breakdown? Yep. Yeah. So I know Jerry pointed out that this property is in Summit County, and we'd want to see the taxing entity for Summit County's benefit. It's also in the Park City School District, not the Wasatch County School District.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and we want to see that as well laid out here, because Park City School District would apparently benefit from this development.
I think if you do that, Chris, I'm not sure that we've got a vision on how the school's going to work. It could be a charter school. I mean, the goal is to improve the opportunities for the Wasatch community around here. So we've got to figure out how we're going to do that.
Yeah, but I'm saying this is on the tax bill that property tax bill that a resident would pay. I think the assumption is that taxing entity would be Summit County and the school district taxing entity would be Park City School District.
I'll
Okay.
confirm all of the different taxing entities and
Great.
revise that information.
Same thing, yeah. I'm not sure about fire coverage, and it's
That's pretty consistent. The costs associated with that are pretty consistent.
okay. But I mean, it would be important to reflect all the correct entities, and given this assumptions that you had, which I think are fine.
Okay.
Just making sure we have the correct entities and the right rates for them.
Yep, I will do
Thank
that.
you.
Okay. Thanks again. There's a few questions that have come in. I'll attempt to address them. So one question was, what happens if the growth rates and the usage rates don't match the model? Obviously, that would slow the return on the project if it's less, and increase it if it's more. So timing is based on sort of averages that these guys have as from experience, and the build out rates as suggested by the models. So we also was a question about the county getting the taxes, and we recognize that needs to be corrected. That's not specific to the question I'll come back to later, because there's a couple of questions here that are not specific to the finance part. And there's a question about a tram. I don't know anything about that they're suggesting that Skyridge is building a tram as well. And I don't know at all anything about the Skyridge tram, or there being one. So that's something we would investigate before we would even additionally consider doing something else for the lift. There's another question that's not related to finance, which I'll come back to later.
My guess is anything from Skyridge is going to ferry people over to Deer Valley and the Mayflower, not up to the Richardson Peak. But that's a guess.
Okay. Again, thank you, ladies. Those of you who've asked questions that aren't specifically related to finance, I'll come back to those at the end. And we're going to move now to the environmental study. So if you can stop sharing if you haven't already, you have, thanks. And Brian, Brent, if you're there, there's Brent. Which one of you is going to share?
So Brian's going to go ahead and share. So Brian, if you'd bring those slides up, please. Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, everyone. We appreciate the opportunity to share with you this evening some of the findings associated with the environmental baseline assessment that we've performed. Brian and I both work for an environmental and geotechnical consulting company called Geosyntec. Geosyntec has 1,500 employees throughout North America and focuses and specializes in site investigation and remediation type activities. So Brian, if you'll move to the next slide, I'll provide a brief introduction of ourselves and an overview of what we've been tasked to do. And then I'll turn the time to Brian, who will share some of the details about the study and the findings. So again, I'm Brent Robinson. I'm a civil engineer, professional engineer with about 25 years of experience. I'm joined by Brian, who's a geologist with many years of experience as well, conducting site investigation and remediation activities. Why don't you move to the next slide, please, Brian? Okay, so we were tasked to conduct a baseline environmental assessment of parcel SS86, and that's, I believe, about 138 acres of the larger Silver Meadows annexation. It's the closest portion of the property to the Richardson Flat sites. And the purpose of our study was to perform an assessment of the current conditions at the site to help us understand if there are any impacts associated with the Richardson Flat site or any other potential sources that could be impacting the site and that might cause any additional investigation or remediation or environmental controls that might be needed in conjunction with future development as proposed. As you well know, the site is located in close proximity to the Richardson Flat Tailings Impoundment, or OU1 of the Richardson Flat site. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Richardson Flats because you know about it, you're close to it, and we've talked about it before. And we're also joined by our friends from the EPA and the Utah Department of Environmental Quality that I think will speak to the Richardson Flat sites. But a couple of things that are worth noting is that OU1 is again located in close proximity to the proposed annexation. It's located to the northwest and is adjacent to the parcel SS86, which was the focus of our investigation. Mining tailings were placed within OU1 from approximately 1953 through the early 1980s. And then investigation and remediation activities were conducted starting in the early 2000s, and those activities were conducted under the oversight of the EPA and Utah Department of Environmental Quality. It's important to note that the primary constituents of concern or contaminants that were identified at OU1 and the other Richardson Flats study areas were heavy metals, primarily arsenic and lead and zinc. I point that out because those are the primary constituents that we evaluated for during our assessment. Remediation activities were completed at the site in the early 2000s, and there are ongoing activities at the site. Now, perhaps the most noteworthy is that the EPA conducts a review of the site every 5 years because there are waste materials that still exist within the site. The EPA comes back and evaluates the remedies that have been put in place and to make sure that they're protective of human health and environment. And the most recent review, 5-year review, was conducted in 2018, again by the EPA. And the findings of that review showed that the remedies that are in place and the measures that have been implemented are protective of human health and the environment. And there are additional activities that will be conducted at the site going down the road, but those will be conducted under the oversight of the EPA and Utah Department of Environmental Quality. It is important to point out that the Richardson Flat site is not located within the proposed annex area. The annex area is not located within that study area. So with that, let's talk specifically about what our scope of work was and what we did to evaluate baseline conditions at the site. So Brian?
Thanks, Brent. Can everybody hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Great. So as Brent indicated, I'm going to now talk about a little bit about the scope of work that we completed and the analytical results from the samples that were collected. So the sampling scope included the collection of 14 surface water samples, 2 groundwater samples from the site, and then 2 surface water samples. All samples were analyzed from metals, which, as Brent mentioned, are the constituents of concern for Richardson Flats. The baseline samples are shown on this slide on the figure to the right here. The surface soil locations are the brownish yellow triangles. The groundwater sample locations are located up in the northwest corner of the site, and those are the blue and black circular symbols up there, and those were collected from the furthest, or what is presumed to be the down gradient edge of the property, or just up gradient from the Richardson Flats site. So the boundary of the Richardson Flats site is shown in yellow here relative to parcel SS86, which is the purple line. The presumed groundwater flow direction is based on, the general topography of the area, which slopes to the northwest, as well as groundwater data that has been collected from the Richardson Flats site. And then finally, the two surface water samples, which are the blue circles, which are present in the middle of the site here with the X's in them, were collected from a ephemeral drainage that is present within parcel SS86. It's important to note that that drainage does not contain perennial water. It's the water there is present only infrequently. Generally would be present in the spring after snowmelt or after high precipitation events, but the water is not so there's not a running stream in there continually, and it's for the most of the time that drainage is dry. So those were the samples that were collected from the site, and now I'll move on to discuss the results of the different samples that were analyzed. So I'll talk about surface soil samples first, and then I'll move on and talk about the groundwater sample results, and then we'll finish up with talking about the two surface soil samples. So this is a summary table showing the analytical results from the surface soil samples that were collected. As previously mentioned, the surface samples were collected from across the site. Those samples were collected from 0 to 3 inches, and those were collected to be representative of kind of shallow uppermost soil within the site, to be representative of near surface conditions, and in particular representative of potential wind-blown tailings that might have been transported on the site from the adjacent Richardson Flats property. A review of the data shows that all of the concentrations within the samples were below relevant EPA residential soil screening levels, with the exception of arsenic. And I'll talk a little bit about arsenic in a minute and how that fits into the context of what we saw in the data. But what that data shows is generally that the concentrations that were observed are generally would be considered protective of human health and the environment, and are generally below levels that are typically would require any kind of further remediation or cleanup. Now, as mentioned, arsenic concentrations were detected above these residential soil screening levels, but the arsenic concentrations that were observed in the samples are consistent with naturally occurring background levels and do not indicate potential impacts from the Richardson Flats site. And I'll just note that elevated levels of naturally occurring arsenic are common in Utah, as they are throughout the West. And this is something we see at sites all over. We typically see concentrations of this order of magnitude at sites throughout northern Utah, and this is not uncommon. So to maybe dive a little bit deeper into the arsenic concentrations and provide a little bit of context. Arsenic occurs naturally. It's a trace element, and it's found in many rocks and sediments. On the right here, we've got a figure that it was prepared by the United States Geological Survey, and this shows arsenic concentrations in the United States in surface soil. And the red areas, red and yellow areas, are indicative of areas with higher concentrations of naturally occurring arsenic. And then the blue areas are lower concentrations. So you can see there's a large portion of northern Utah that has naturally occurring elevated levels of arsenic. As shown on the slide, arsenic concentrations within the site were detected at concentrations ranging from 5.5 milligrams per kilogram to 14 milligrams per kilogram. And to put those levels into context, with data that has been collected in the surrounding area, as part of the investigation and characterization of the Richardson Flats site, both the OU1 site, which includes the tailing impoundment, which is immediately adjacent to parcel SS86, as well as other portions of the site. The background samples have been collected as part of those studies, show concentrations that range from 6.7 milligrams per kilogram to 17.5 milligrams per kilogram. So generally consistent with what we saw within parcel SS86. So based on that, the data indicates that the levels of arsenic that we are seeing within the site are representative of naturally occurring background levels and not representative of, potential impacts that may have been caused by the adjacent Richardson Flat property. So moving on to the groundwater sample results. Again, the table on the right is a summary of the analytical results. Again, there was 2 samples that were collected from temporary borings on the down gradient portion of the property. The samples from those borings showed detections for dissolved concentrations of arsenic, barium, chromium, nickel, and selenium in one or both of the samples. Reviewing those results, all of the results are below relevant Utah groundwater quality standards. And the data do not appear to indicate that potentially impacted groundwater from the Richardson Flat property has migrated onto parcel SS86. And that's consistent with what we'd expect. We expect groundwater that's flowing northwest away from parcel SS86 and the rest of the Silver Meadows annexation property. So this property is up gradient of the Richardson Flat property, which is down gradient. So finally, the surface water sample data. Again, there was 2 surface water samples, and those were collected for that ephemeral drainage, which is present in the central portion of the property. The results from those samples are summarized on the table here on the slide. The results were conservatively compared to the Utah surface water quality standards for drinking water and human health. And I just want to point out real quickly that this was a very conservative comparison. This was done because it was the most stringent criteria. Surface water is not currently used within the site for drinking water, and nor is it anticipated that it would be used as part of any future development. So the comparison to those drinking water standards is very conservative. The data shows that there were no exceedances in the furthest upstream sample, but in the downstream sample, we did see slight exceedances for arsenic and antimony. And you can see on the table there, under sample SW02, which was the furthest downstream sample, the antimony concentration was detected at a concentration of 0.00762 micrograms per liter in comparison to a numeric water quality criteria of 0.0056 milligrams per liter, and arsenic was detected at 0.178 milligrams per liter in comparison to surface water criteria of 0.01 milligrams per liter. So both those concentrations very close to the comparison criteria. So based on those results, I'm sorry. While those exceedances of those standards were noted, those are likely related to naturally occurring background concentrations. Based on the following lines of evidence. First, parcel SS86 and the rest of the proposed annexation area is hydrology is higher in elevation and hydraulically up gradient from the Richardson Flat site. So we would not expect surface water from Richardson Flat to flow onto the property. So it's upstream of the Richardson Flat property. And additionally, we don't see elevated levels of metals in the other media. We don't see, as noted previously, the surface soil samples did not show evidence of impact. Concentrations were below site screening levels or consistent with naturally occurring background concentrations. So there's not evidence to indicate either in the soil or groundwater data that there's other impacts that would be providing a source to the observed concentrations that we see in surface water. So to summarize, overall, the baseline sample results do not appear to show evidence of impact to parcel SS86 from the Richardson Flat site. Additionally, excuse me, identified metal concentrations are below relevant screening levels, where they are representative of, typical background concentrations. And then finally, based on the above findings, we don't believe that the baseline assessment suggests that there's further need for additional environmental investigation or controls as part of any future development. So with that, we'll pause here and open up the floor for questions from the council or any other questions that might be come in.
Well, Mayor, would this be a good time to follow with our gentleman from EPA?
They will in a minute, Ralph. I'd like to see if we can have questions specific to the study before we bring them in, if that's okay.
Fine.
Well, hey, this is Chris Beyer, council member.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for making a very technical study easily understandable for lay people like myself. One of the questions that I've heard or concerns I've heard from the people that our constituents is what is the effect of wind? There's a lot of wind around, and can you comment on any observations that you made through your study on, how wind might have moved contaminated soil around over the years?
Yeah, so potential wind-blown transport of, tailings from the Richardson Flat site onto the property, it would be the primary concern for transport, or contamination of the site, other areas. So that's something that we did look at, and that was the purpose of the surface soil samples. And I'll mention that, that's something that's been looked at as part of the site characterization investigation studies that have gone on within Richardson's Flat as well. The studies have been overseen by EPA, and they can maybe speak to that more directly. So relative to that concern, as indicated, these surface soil samples do not suggest that potential windblown transport of contaminants has occurred. The results show that the soil samples are, within the concentrations are consistent with levels that are protective of human health and the environment, and in particular with regard to arsenic, which was detected above, those general screening levels. The concentrations are consistent with background concentrations, so they'd be similar to the levels of arsenic that you would find any other property, that's native or undisturbed area in the surrounding region. So it's no different than any other property. And I guess relative to potential future transport of contaminants, the current status of the Richardson Flat site is the remediation has been completed. Those tailings have been consolidated into an impoundment and covered with clean fill material. So they are therefore, potential future windblown transport is not expected to be a concern.
Brian, when were the tailings from Empire Canyon and the Montage added to OU1?
That, I don't know, have a specific date on that. That's something
was that prior to 2000 when it was considered remediated, or was it after that?
I don't have a date on that. That's something that maybe EPA can speak to.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
They're coming up next, Jerry, so I might say that.
And Brian, this is Ralph. Did you factor in, so one of the things that we're certainly considering or would like to consider is potential partial or total remediation of the site. Did that come into any of your analysis at this point?
When you say partial or total remediation of the site, which site are you referring to?
Talking OU1.
Okay.
So, yeah. So if we made that into a,
We didn't look at that at all, Ralph. We
Yeah.
did not look at that at all. That's
okay. I didn't think so, but I was just wondering if that was kind of factored in. That's fine.
Okay.
Other questions from council?
I'll just, if I could piggyback on my earlier question, I asked about wind now. It sounds like the conclusion is because SS 86 is higher in elevation than OU1, we're not expecting any surface water contamination, and there was no evidence of it. Would you have expected surface water contamination in elevations that were below OU1?
EPA, I presume an EPA could probably speak more directly and they probably have more current information on conditions relative to that.
Okay.
You know, that you would expect to have higher concentrations downstream, you know, of OU1 versus upstream.
Okay, thank you. Oh, one other question. Is SS 86, does it have the capacity to be flooded? In other words, if there's a, I don't know, 100-year storm or something, have you considered a possible impact of perhaps surface water contamination if there is some unusual flood?
We did not look at that as part of this study.
And this is Brent chirping in, but maybe to circle back to your prior question about surface water down gradient of OU1, you know, the 2018 5-year review conducted by EPA showed that the surface waters exiting OU1 were below the water quality standards. So if there were impacts, you'd expect them to be down gradient, as Brian suggested, but apparently there have not been significant impacts identified.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you again, gentlemen. Appreciate it very much. There are no questions specifically. Well, there's one that somebody asked, they couldn't read the scale on the colorful map. What color do our results fall into? Our results fall into orange on that map. In other words, the map of the whole U.S. showing arsenic results, our numbers are in the orange to orange range.
Yeah, our numbers would be more in probably the orange to yellow range.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The other questions that came in, again, are not specific to the study. I will address those a little bit later this evening, as soon as we get through the EPA review. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. If you would release the share, thank you. You're obviously welcome to stay on, but not required. Ralph, can you do the introduction for the EPA folks?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. We have actually 4 gentlemen, but the 2 are Rob Parker, who's project manager for the US EPA, and Doug Bacon, who serves as the counterpart for the Utah Department of Environmental Quality. They've really done the studies, I think the last 5-year study, and Rob's going to take us through some context, some history and background. And in my previous conversations with him and Doug, it centered around current activity at the site, you know, what kinds of remediation would be appropriate, disturbance around the site and how that could affect OU1, and then correspondingly re-affect SS 86. And then, you know, same kinds of questions that Chris was asking, things around wind, you know, wind picking up and, you know, the 100-year storm kind of thing. So I'm going to turn this over to Rob and I think Doug, who are really going to give us kind of the EPA context around this. Take over, Rob.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Ralph, and thank you all for the invitation this evening to come speak with you about the work that EPA and the state of Utah have done at Richardson Flat. I will have a brief presentation that I'll share with you, just to kind of do some high-level overview work of the work that that we have done at Operable Unit 1 in particular, but also tie in some of the ongoing work that EPA and the state are working on for some of the other areas of the Richardson Flats site. Before I start, I want to introduce a couple people as well. With me from EPA is Ryan Cloverdans. He is a community involvement coordinator with EPA. And then also Dave Allison is on the line as well, and he is with the state of Utah and is also a community involvement coordinator. So I appreciate everyone from EPA and the state joining me in this call. And again, thank you for the invitation to present. Like I said, I do have a presentation. I'm going to do my best to share my screen here. And let's hope that after 14 or 15 months of this, I've got this down.
Good start. Proceed.
All right. It's always funny, you know, it's like, we've done this many, many times before, but whenever you need it the most, that's when it will typically fail. So just to confirm, are you guys just seeing a presentation just with the one slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for the confirmation. So, again, the presentation that I'm going to be talking about tonight is primarily focused on OU1. We're going to talk about the past investigation work that took place there, the past remediation work that has taken place there, and then also potential next steps that EPA and the state may be utilizing that area for. So just a little bit of background, and I promise almost all of my slides are all words. So we have only a few pictures mixed in, so it'll be less fun than the last presentation, but hopefully it'll be brief and you guys will have a good background on this. So EPA is responding to releases at the Richardson Flats site pursuant to our authority provided by Congress under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, known as CERCLA for short, because we are the federal government, there are acronyms. Typically that's referred to as Superfund. In pretty much in all instances of a Superfund site, we go through a very robust process of first trying to characterize the site when we want to understand what's happening at the site, the types of contaminants that are there, and how those contaminants are impacting the environment. And that informs our evaluation of potential response actions, which is that next step. We go through a robust process to look at a variety of response options and decide on which response option makes the most sense for the situation. And then finally, we go through an actual cleanup phase. As the folks from Geosyntec mentioned earlier, we do in this case have ongoing ongoing check-ins, if you will, the 5-year review process at Operable Unit 1 due to the fact that there is contamination on site. We just want to make sure that any waste that's left in place is still, the remedy is still protective. So again, it's investigate, evaluate, and then take action are really the three steps there. And that's important because at this site, we're actually in all of those steps, depending on where we're talking about the site. The next slide, I'll have an image that shows the layout of the project. And so you can put a map to these different areas, but we have 3 distinct areas at this site. The one that we're really talking about tonight is Operable Unit 1, which is the former impoundment that you all are aware of now. The remedy, the implementation at that portion of the site is largely complete. So we're over here in terms of the remedy's been implemented. We're in that 5-year review process, just checking up on it every 5 years, which is required by law. But we also want to make sure that that the remedy is still protective. Other portions of the site are what we call Operable Units 2 and 3. That's really the floodplain tailings of that are along Silver Creek. And within those operable units, we're really early on. We're in that site characterization process, trying to understand where we are or where contamination is located, how it's impacting the creek and potential users near the creek. And then the last distinct area that I want to highlight is what we call Operable Unit 4, which is really tucked in, close to Park City. It's the outfall of essentially a French drain that was installed to lower the water table near Prospector Park. And that's, like I said, on the downstream side, if you will, of Park City. And at that location, we're really in that remedy evaluation. It's that middle step, that remedy evaluation that's going on right now. So just to put a map to where we're talking about here. See if I can pull up my laser pointer. All right. So operable unit 1, the impoundment is down here in the southeast corner of the site. I don't know the specifics of the property that you all are considering annexing, but my understanding is it's south and to the east of that location. So just to provide a frame of reference there. The other areas of the site that we're working on are operable unit 2 and 3, which is along the floodplain of Silver Creek. And in this case, Silver Creek is flowing from Park City out to the east and then to the north along this valley. And as we talked about, or as other folks had talked about earlier, the hydraulic picture here really is water pushing from the uphill side of OU1 down towards the creek. And so, I think the questions earlier about, water migrating, I would agree with what's been said, and that, I would anticipate that water, surface water and groundwater in this area is going to be really flowing towards the north in this location. And then the last operable mention is that French drain, the outfall of that French drain, which is in that Prospector Park neighborhood here. So the next picture, and sorry for the graininess, I tried to find a better picture, but we're working on full scan documents here. So I wanted to provide, this is an image from our record of decision. So in 2005, EPA issued a record of decision for operable unit 1. And this is just to provide a little bit of context from what that impoundment looked like at the time. We identified 2 different tailings area A and tailings area B. And part of, and we're going to talk about this in just a second, but part of the work that the United Park City Mines under oversight of EPA completed was really consolidating this material from tailings area B into the impoundment at tailings area A. And so wanted just to provide this image, just to provide a frame of reference for the future slides here. There are 3 key takeaways that I wanted to share with you today. And we're going to go through each of these line by line in the next 3 slides, and then certainly turn it over for questions that you all may have. The first takeaway is for operable unit 1, where while we are at the remedy implementation stage, we did go through that process for operable unit 1. We went through a characterization step, and we call that a remedial investigation. And the OU1 remedial investigation really delineates the nature and extent of contamination. And so in this case, we'll talk about it on the next slide. We went through the effort to look at where we think contamination, that boundary of contamination was. The second thing that I wanted to make sure you leave with today is that we have implemented a remedy at operable unit 1. The goal of that remedy is to mitigate soil migration and exposure to recreational users, which I'll talk about in a couple slides. And then the third thing is that EPA is continuing to work on the Richardson Flat site, and specifically at OUs 2 and 3, as well as OU4. And part of the evaluation that we're likely to do would include evaluating further consolidation of tailings material into the OU1 impoundment, which I'll talk about in 3 slides. So the first key takeaway is that the remedial investigation determined the nature and extent of contamination. So the image that I've highlighted here came from our the remedial investigation, and specifically this is a figure of the southern end of operable unit 1 with samples that were collected along what came to be the boundary of operable unit 1. And what I wanted to demonstrate here is that we're tasked with identifying where contamination is located and where the extent of that contamination is, and that informs our decision making as we choose to select and implement a remedy. And so in this case, as part of that early 2000s remedial investigation, samples were collected to help identify if there was, if the boundary of the site needed to be different. What turned out to be is that the record of decision was focused on, the area where we took the actions. And so essentially, we did delineate that extent of contamination there. The second thing that I said I was going to highlight is that we've taken an action at the site. The 2005 record of decision included these elements. There are a couple other elements as well, but relevant to the conversation tonight, I wanted to highlight these ones. First, we consolidated materials. So like I said earlier, the tailings location B, the material that was there has been relocated into the main impoundment. Second, we covered or ensured that the tailings were covered with an 18-inch cap of clean material. There is a little nuance there in that some of the cells do only have a 6-inch temporary cap right now, and that's by design. As I mentioned earlier, and we'll talk about again in the next slide, there's still ongoing work related to tailings in the floodplain. And so it was done with intent to put a temporary amount of cap in certain cells of the repository in order to allow for additional material from OUs 2 and 3 to come onto that repository. If EPA decides to bring material onto that impoundment within those cells, we would certainly look to implement the record of decision as it was written and cover any additional material with that 18 inches of clean fill to match the rest of the impoundment. Alternatively, if we decide not to do that, we would look to cover back to the 18 inches in order to consider the ROD fully implemented. Either way, I want to point out that cap material prevents the additional spreading of contamination, as well as provides a layer that would break the path between a user of the site and the contaminated tailings underneath that cap material. And then the third thing that I wanted to highlight was that the ROD does call for limiting the uses of the land that is comprised of Operable Unit 1. Specifically, the risk assessments looked at recreational use, and the record of decision, or the ROD, calls for land use controls to be put in place for this to limit the uses for recreational use. I understand from the previous presentation that the residential, this area wouldn't be used for residential, but certainly if that were to change, we would want to be involved with that process. The last line here is these actions are largely complete. Like I said, there's certainly a temporary amount of cap at certain locations, as well as, frankly, the land use controls still need to be implemented. But most of the construction work is complete. And then the third thing that I wanted to highlight was that we do continue to work at Operable Unit 2 and 3. And so as part of that, even though we're in the characterization phase, we think that it's likely that we would evaluate consolidating some of those tailings materials that are in OU 2 and 3 back into OU 1, just to bring all that material into one unit that we would have to keep an eye on as part of our 5-year review process. That decision hasn't been made yet, to be clear. And frankly, we haven't, we're still in that characterization phase. And so, this really is just a takeaway, just to provide a little bit of context into, future decisions that the EPA in consultation with the state are going to have to go through. As I said earlier and highlighted by the second sentence here, these, at the end, when we say that the remedy is completed OU1, we're going to have the appropriate amount of cover material in place. So if we put additional tailings material onto OU1, we would look to cover it. But alternatively, if we choose not to bring any additional material, we would be looking to cover as well. And then the last slide is I'm going to leave it here just for as questions are coming in, just to help remind folks of what those three things are. Essentially going from where we started in characterization phase. EPA looked to characterize the operable unit to ensure we understood nature and extent. Based on that characterization, we decided to take certain actions to protect human health and the environment and protect against recreational use in particular. And then finally, EPA is still continuing to do work at the site overall, and those actions at other portions of the site may have some impact on what we're looking to do at OU1, but certainly we want to do it in a manner that's protective of human health and the environment. Like I said, I really appreciate the time tonight, and certainly be happy to answer any questions that you all may have.
Yeah, this is Bob Nadelberg, Town Council. I had a question, and by the way, thank you very much for a very good presentation. That answered a lot of my questions. One thing that struck me is in item number 1, oh no, it's not on there anymore. You said future OU2 and OU3 analysis may require moving some of that contaminated material back to OU1. In the decision to do that, let's say that was decided to happen maybe 10 years from now, and presuming there was already housing built in the Richardson Flats area, in what way may that impact your decision as to where to move the tailings? For instance, if there is sufficient housing density there, would the EPA be more inclined to consider moving that elsewhere, maybe out to Tooele or somewhere else? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly as part of our evaluation, we look to factors like whether or not a remedy is implementable, and surrounding land use, can play into that decision. Conversely, the option that you raised about Tooele, we also look at other factors such as cost and the impact that hauling material out to the facility in Tooele would be costly. So that being said, there certainly are factors that EPA look at, and how I think implementability is really a key thing in terms of how our action may impact others is a factor that we would look at. So if there are a larger housing development, for instance, that could be a factor that would be considered.
Rob, do you have any type of map that shows exactly where OU1 is in relation to what's going to be developed?
I don't actually have, that might be a question.
Carol, Carol, we have that. I can bring that up for you. It was in the prior presentation, but we can show you where that fits in just a little bit. Let's come back to that. But the parcel SS86 is one corner of that parcel of SS86 adjoins the OU1 parcel.
Right, and that would be where they would be potentially moving some of the contaminated soil?
Not necessarily to the border of that. The Richardson Flat OU1 site is fairly large, so it doesn't necessarily mean that they would dump it right next to a building. That's Rob, which is stated that's something he would take into consideration as they think about how they do that.
Yeah, that's correct. And so specifically what's correct is that, there are locations where you have a temporary amount of cover material within the impoundment, and they're centralized within the impoundment. They're not necessarily on the edge of operable unit 1.
Rob, to point out, it should also be noted the existing repository is not along the edge of OU1's boundary line. The existing impoundment that is temporarily capped as well as permanently capped in some locations is to the north of that boundary line. So when you do see that figure, I don't know who mentioned was going to bring it up. Just keep in mind the repository is not right on the boundary. The other thing to make note is if the decision were to be to remove some of the materials from OU2 and OU3 back into the repository, there are environmental controls that are employed during that work effort to control dust and to control runoff to ensure that those materials stay where they are placed until permanently covered once the cover is established. So there's ongoing environmental controls that are part of that work effort, if that were as the direction taken in the future.
Thanks for that addition, Doug. I wanted to bring back a question that I posed to the GEO team as well, and that is, do you have any timeline on when the Empire Canyon Montage tailings were added to the impoundment?
I'm sorry to say I don't know. That work was done prior to my involvement at this project, but I can certainly look back and get that information for you.
Anybody else from the EPA team that has some sense of that? I mean, we've heard some differing conversations here about, well, it's been under, in maintenance since the early 2000s, but we thought the Montage stuff happened after that. So we're just trying to get some sense for what the timelines are.
Sure. Yeah, I doubt anyone else on the project team here would be able to answer it. So I can pull that information and provide that to you. Who should I send that to? And
to the mayor, to Phil.
Okay.
You can send it or to Ralph. It's fine if you have Ralph's contact.
I do have Ralph's contact info, so I'm happy to send it to Ralph. Or Ralph, if you have a different recipient, if you wouldn't mind just letting me know, I'd appreciate it.
No problem. And Rob, I kind of a follow-up question, because I know we've had our discussions. I want to leave this to others, but just on the disturbance and activity in the future, who's controlling whether additional new tailings would be moved into OU1? Who makes it, where does that begin? Is that, say, if Park City wanted to start that activity up, do they then go to you next? What's the process for approval on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that probably is too complicated for me to answer here. There certainly are a lot of different interests in that land, and a number of controlling legal documents that would probably require someone with a more advanced law degree than the one that I have from nowhere to be able to answer. So I'm just a lowly engineer, but proud of it. So I appreciate the question, and it's certainly one that when we get to a point where EPA would be looking to take actions at operable units 2 and 3, one that we're going to be keenly interested in answering as well.
So on the converse side of that, Rob, because I know we talked about this as well, what could be, is there a process to make this recreational? Because that was one of the bullets that you brought up in the previous slide. So I would think that would be then moving tailings out or covering them up in an appropriate way without any additional activity going on. Is that true or not true?
So, Ralph, just to confirm, are you asking what would it take for this land to become recreational? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I think that's, obviously where we'd like to head this land, because if we build residential, it would be nice to add recreational. It would be nice to add, kind of reduce the impact of an OU1 site and further make that, somewhat useful, which you alluded to here anyway.
And improve the cosmetics of it as well, because it's an ugly location right now.
Yeah. So right now, part of the record of decision was geared towards this land being used for recreational purposes. And there's as part of our risk assessment, we evaluated hikers and trail riders and even horseback and other more active uses such as a ball field. And as part of that evaluation, as part of our what ended up being the record of decision, EPA took the steps that we did in terms of covering the material with cap material in order to allow for those types of recreational uses. So I think that we certainly would like to be involved in that process as land is converted to a higher use than it is right now. But I think that the cap material that was selected and installed as part of the remedy implementation, it's clean at the point where any contaminants that are in it are below certain thresholds that would allow for recreational uses.
Thanks, Rob.
So Rob, following on Ralph and Jerry's comments about recreational use, I wanted to ask a question anyway. The developer who's developing or would be developing Silver Meadows if this annexation is approved has also expressed an interest in actually expending some funds, if it's feasible, to kind of level out the Richardson Flat site, OU1 site, to make it more accessible recreationally, to turn it into a park. And so that seems like it's in line with the goal from EPA. Again, do you know what the process would be and the EPA involved? Does EPA provide any funding for that by any chance? Or would that all have to be provided from local funds?
We certainly would, entertain any ideas as part of a negotiation to understand, what a developer might be interested in doing. We would be optimistic that we can, find a mutually agreeable solution as it pertains to, reforming or really altering the current landscape. We would have interest in it because, as of right now, the remedy is in place for the cap material is where it is. And so if that is disturbed, we would be most likely looking into entering into some sort of agreement to, oversee that work. But we can certainly, participate in any discussions with the developer or whomever that, may be interested in doing that.
And Doug, maybe, is there any Utah funds that are available? So not just federal funds, but what's the state provide to help clean up sites like this and make it more recreational?
EPA has the lead under the removal program in CERCLA. EPA retains that lead. We provide substantive input and partnership with EPA and support. We don't have a separate funding source directly. I would say that, just like Rob just noted, and hopefully I don't misstep here, but certainly there'd be an interest on both DEQ's part and EPA's part to understand how that property might get redeveloped, and certainly would welcome a chance to be part of that process. It may require some agreements, as Rob noted, but we don't have a separate funding source, Ralph.
Thanks, Doug.
And I want to be clear too that part of what I just said with related to wanting to be involved is because we would be in this hypothetical altering an existing remedy. So we want to ensure that that the site remains protective of human health and the environment, and that's our prime interest. But to get there are many paths, and so if there's interest from the developer to or the current landowner, whomever, to change the remedy, we certainly would engage on that and be willing to work through that process.
Thanks.
Hi, Rob. This is. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I've just got a follow-on question. Thank you, Chris, for both Doug or Rob. Kind of also piggybacking on Barry's question about the montage debris that's been deposited there. There's been a lot of construction debris that's not contaminated, just excavation extras, so to speak. When you build into a mountain here, you have to dig a lot. That's been dumped in there. I would hope that both the EPA and the Utah Protecting Agency would understand where the contaminated tailings are versus the cleaner fill kind of dirt. Is that true? Have you guys mapped all that out and kept track of that?
So, this is private land. There is an agreement between EPA. I believe the state is a party to the agreement as well, and United Park City Mines, who is the land there, where United Park City Mines is required to seek EPA approval to bring contaminated mine waste to this location. And, they have sought that approval, but it has not been granted for a variety of reasons. That said, there's still private land. And so, United Park is able bring non-contaminated materials, clean material to house at their facility pursuant to whatever private agreement they may have. That material does have value for our overall remedy because, as I said earlier, there is clean material. There'd be essentially a clean material stockpile for those areas that require additional cap after the decision regarding the tailings. So to answer your question, there hasn't been any contaminated material that has been brought to that location since 2010, I believe, is the last date that approval was granted.
Thank you.
Okay, this is Chris. So, Rob, thank you. One question I have is, you mentioned there's certain cells are temporarily capped in the repository with just 6 inches. In case the EPA decides to bring in OU 2 or 3 soils, can you characterize the approximate amount or percentage of the total of OU1 that's only temporarily capped? And then is there a number of, millions of capacity of the amount of soil that could come in from OU 2 or 3?
Yeah, those are great questions. With regard to, sorry, I'm getting some feedback. With regard to the percentage question, I can look into it. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to look into it in the same time frame as getting the information regarding the montage material. With regard to the capacity question, that's a key question. I think we certainly have done some preliminary calculations to evaluate what the theoretical capacity of those remaining cells could be. That being said, we would want to ensure that that material it brought to that location, is managed in an appropriate way. And so, I think that would be dependent on how much material would be dependent on the types of uses that are happening at this time, that evaluation, that decision is being made. And so, there remains, I think, quite a bit of flexibility around, what amount of material might go to OU1.
One other kind of question similarly related. You mentioned this land is privately owned, and I'm assuming that's United Park City Mines still privately owns OU1.
I'm not sure, to be honest.
Okay, if that were to change hands and another private owner took control of the OU1 property, do they have the ability to say, "Hi, we don't want it. We don't want this repository to take in any more contaminated soils. We'd like to shut it down," or is this still, EPA taking the lead and making the decisions?
So EPA would look to, I think it's if there's a land transfer, I think it's very likely that the new purchaser would come in and work with the EPA to essentially create an administrative order on consent, which is a mutual agreement between the parties, where we would look to essentially negotiate with that landowner to make sure that our mutual interests are met. That new landowner would be able to do what they're looking to do, and EPA would try to reserve the rights of what we're looking to do. And so I think it's dependent on how that land transfer takes place is the answer. And sorry that I can't answer that with more specificity. It's certainly a blend between the technical, my technical piece, and certainly a legal component of those land transfers.
I think you answered it perfectly. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
Thanks again, gentlemen. Any further questions from council for these guys. Otherwise, I'm going to ask if you would, Rob, release the screen. I will pop up. So there you go. I'm going to pop up a quick picture because to try and address Carol's question, you should be seeing, and I'll make it a little bit bigger. Get it into the middle of the screen. So this is the SS86 parcel is in the purple. And this yellow line is the boundary of the OU1 parcel. So you see we only adjoin closely right over here, where my cursor is moving. So does that help you all better understand where this is?
Yes.
Okay. Well, good. That was the intent.
Thank you, Mayor.
And
You're
Mayor, what do you recall what is in that corner near SS01? What type of where is that the commercial piece if I remember
Yeah,
correctly?
that's the commercial piece. And
Yeah.
again, you know, I first of all, I want to thank all of the speakers tonight, and the consultants for doing the great job that they did for us. I hope that the message that we've conveyed to the constituency is that the town of Hideout is committed to ensuring that any development that may occur will be done in a way that is fiscally responsible, environmentally safe, and ensures appropriate mitigation to impacts to traffic, including auto, bicycle, and pedestrian. We worked hard as a council to structure an MDA that addressed these kinds of concern issues. The work that we've just presented is part of that commitment that we've made to address these issues. And we would not be, and the transparency we're bringing by sharing this information to the community is purposeful so that you all know how hard we're working to make sure we understand the concern points that the constituency have raised. So, so that's great. There are some other questions that are not specific to the stuff we talked about tonight that I want to cover from messages sent to hideoututah@hideoututah.gov. So they're broader than just the studies tonight, but we'll try and cover them as best as I can. So there was a question around who is the school for? The school is intended in principle to try and address the fact that our public school students in the Wasatch portion of the community travel a very long distance to get to the Wasatch school districts that service them. And you know, the intent of having a school in this environment was to ensure that that we could mitigate that long distance travel. There's discussion as to how to do that. A charter school might make sense in that it's K through 12, but versus a elementary and secondary school kind of system. But that's to be determined based on input and survey. But that's the intent of what the school's for. There was a question about the land that isn't being annexed and it remaining green space or otherwise, and we don't know what the landowners who have the remaining properties have in mind for those uses. So I can't really tell you that everything else is going to stay green or not. That's that landowners have rights. Those properties are that are not in the area that's being considered for annexation are in Summit County, and that would be a Summit County discussion. A lot of questions on the services. Where are they all going to come from? The answer to that is they will come, but they're not defined. And the reason they're not defined is that this annexation is not complete. if it is voted to be, voted in by the community, then the landowners who are in this area have a legal right to be serviced by the public entities that provide the public services. How those are going to be occurring have to be negotiated. It could be interlocal agreements. It could be some combination of those and providing some of them within the cost of the operating cost of the development. But at the end of the day, the public services that provide water and sewer and so forth can't say can't say no. There has to we may not like the cost structures or whatever, but they can't say because you're here, nobody's going to service you. So at least that's my understanding from a legal perspective. And certainly, again, the town of Hideout would not, as it does today, we don't allow developers to build who don't have will serve letters from the service providers. And so should the annexation be successful, then that requirement is a requirement of the way Hideout does business. And anybody who wanted to build anything would have to come with the letters that say that whatever water district they struck a deal with will provide the water, and the sewer district will provide the sewer, and those kinds of things. So there was a question about the existing ponds that are further towards Park City along Richardson Flat Roads, which are over here this way. And the question was, what are we doing to those ponds? Well, this parcel does not impact those ponds. So we won't do anything to those ponds. What other things go on with these pieces of property in the future, I can't say. Address the services. There's a question on what will the cut and fill look like to this property. Will it be more aggressive like a Deer Springs, or a little more aggressive than Deer Springs, or be more topographical to the property? The drawings I've seen tend to keep the topography. We certainly don't want to change the runoff flows directions. We've already talked about that, but that's still, the engineering folks will have to look at that and determine how those work.
And Mayor, if I can add, the code changes we passed last year include thresholds that limit the amount of disturbance to the natural grade. So there wasn't caps before, there are now. So the expectation is that the developer is constrained by those new measures, and this will be a less impactful, if we can say it that way, development.
Thanks, Jerry. There's a question that came in about, well, will we allow the residential to be completely built before the commercial is brought into play? The MDA has allowances for a certain amount of residential before commercial must be built. We would not allow, the MDA does not allow future growth of the residential without those commercial pieces. And there's a step plan in there that for X percent of the residential, there's a certain percent of the commercial that has to come in. And they're tied together. So that would be addressed. That is addressed in our MDA. Question on the clarity on there was a question on the clarity on the property tax, which who gets the revenues, which Chris and Jerry alluded to. They would go to Summit County. It's Summit County land. The Summit County taxing entity would get their pieces of the puzzle. I mentioned that the question on the road being in from 248. I already covered that. There was a great question earlier I mentioned about cycling. on the cycling thing that we definitely will take into the planning process. Should this be approved, that we have to make sure that we've designed what we do in a way that we allow the use of travel, road travel for bikes, for cycling.
So Mayor, I'd like to comment on that. As I recall, the AMDA specifies that the development will follow the recommendations of the Parks Open Space Trails Plan for the town. Yeah, and so, you know, we would modify and adopt the plan so that we would recognize, you know, this annexation and the important cycling corridor that it is, and we would, you know, make changes to the plan, and the developer has already agreed to abide by the plan, which, as I said, we haven't updated and adopted yet, but we did get that agreement already.
Great, thanks for reminding us of that. Okay, so those are all the submitted questions that hadn't been addressed in the prior parts. I want to again thank all the participants for the work they've done. We will be sharing these presentations and on the website. As mentioned, we'll get all this to you, as well as when the final versions of all the reports come in, they'll also be posted. And I expect them to be available in the next week. So still prior to the vote, so you will have time to read them in additional detail should you need to. That's really the content for this evening. Great questions by all. We appreciate it very much. And at this point, I would look to a motion to adjourn.
I'll move to adjourn.
Thank you, Carol.
I'll second.
Thank you. Bob, thank you for that. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Ralph, yeah? You good? Oh, you're on mute, but I see your hand was saying yes. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate it very much. And for the council, we'll see you on Thursday.
Okay.
Thank you and good night.